I am here with Dr. Saba Fatima, Professor of Philosophy, SIUE, talking with us today about the Me Too movement in Muslim American communities. Could you begin first by telling us just about the Me Too movement in general?
Well, first, I just want to thank you, Sahar, for having me on. I really appreciate it. That's super kind of you, but more so, I really appreciate the project that you have embarked on, which is to bring philosophical ideas to the public, because I think there's a lot of value in that. So I appreciate that. But coming to your question, the Me Too movement or hashtag Me Too movement, it's a worldwide movement against sexual assault and sexual harassment and has different variations of names in different regions, depending on the local language. So, I mean, women have been fighting against sexual harassment and sexual abuse for a very, very long time. But I think that what makes this particular iteration, the Me Too iteration of the movement, even more powerful is that we're connected through social media. And the phrase Me Too itself, it came about in 2006 when it appeared on the social media platform called MySpace, which is a precursor to Facebook. And it was used by a sexual harassment survivor and activist, Tarana Burke. And she introduced the phrase Me Too. But it gained more traction with Alyssa Milano, who's a Hollywood actress, a white Hollywood actress. And in 2017, she asked people to tweet Me Too to sort of indicate how pervasive sexual harassment actually is. And it got a lot of response. It got like 1.7 million tweets from 85 countries. So that was a lot of feedback. But the other aspect of Me Too movement that I want to touch upon is that what I also see as part of the Me Too movement is the fact that it's also a movement about curtailing rape culture. And this is the culture that enables sexual harassment and assault to take place in the first place. So rape culture would be anything that normalizes violence against women and excuses it, whether that's through media or popular culture. And we do this by using misogynistic language or through objectifying women in advertisements and so on and so forth. And sometimes even glamorizing sexual violence in movies. And that kind of creates a culture where we think that it's normal and excusable that women have to that women are subject to sexual harassment and assault.
Interesting. So you mentioned that in 2017, the Me Too movement gained traction, and you mentioned that it was because of a white person. Is that important in here somehow?
It is to me. It is to me. So Tarana Burke is African American, and Alyssa Milano is white. And you know, when it first started getting traction in 2017 with Alyssa Milano's tweet, I found it quite interesting that it took like a really long while for people to credit Tarana Burke for introducing the phrase. And I think a big reason for the fact that it gained traction on Twitter was precisely because it was tweeted by a white actress. And there are many Black actresses on Twitter who have faced a lot of abuse on Twitter and have faced a lot of uh, misogynistic language, and there has been no uptake of the treatment that they have received. There's been no uproar, and so I think that was kind of interesting to note, um, because it gives us a window into the fact that our aspects of our identity play a role into if people are even going to respond to the injustice that's happening to us. And I think in part people responded because she was white. And for a lot of people of color, people don't even respond when we suffer from injustice because it's taken as normal and as due course.
Interesting. So, what is it about different ethnic communities or different races or different religious communities that make the response to claims of sexual violence either received or ignored? What exactly do you think is going on here in these different kinds of communities?
So I think for me, I think the biggest issue when we talk about the Me Too movement is an absence of an intersectional analysis. And what I mean by intersectional analysis here, I know, yeah, it's a jargony term, but I thankfully it's being recognized more, and people have an intuitive sense of what it is, even when they don't know the term intersectional analysis. But an intersectional lens or an intersectional analysis, what that allows us to see is the fact that our whether it's our race, our ethnicity, our religious identification, our disability status, all of these things are intertwined together, and that they're inseparable from one another. They cannot be separated from one another. And so an example that comes to my mind is the fact that in one particular study they saw that when the victim was white, prosecutors filed charges 75% of the time in sexual assault cases. But when the victim was Black, prosecutors only filed 34% of the time in the same locality, the
Wow.
same police department. So that makes you think like, what, why? Because you cannot just examine gender in isolation, in vacuum. Me being a woman is not the only identity I have. I'm also a Muslim. I'm also brown. I'm a person of color in the United States. I have all these different identities that sort of define me. I'm a person of who lives in a sandwich generation. Like, I take care of my parents, I take care of my kids. There's so many things that play into my socioeconomic status. All of those things play into the kind of uptake I will receive when I bring up some injustice that's happened to me. And also, all of those things play into whether the injustice is going to happen to me in the first place. So
Mm.
my socioeconomic status in large part protects me because I live in this, super safe neighborhood, or and so in that sense, it's not just merely the fact that I'm a woman, but also a woman who lives in one of those cookie cutter neighborhoods, in suburbia. That plays into whether I'm, how safe or unsafe I would be in my own neighborhood. So I think when we talk in like simple terms of like just a gender analysis, like this happens to women, or this happens, this is a problem that women are facing. When we talk, we end up avoiding any real talk of how all the different aspects of our identity cut across the category woman, such as race, socioeconomic status, disability, religion, and also what that means in terms of complicity for those of us who are dominantly situated. So what does it mean for me as a person with a stable socioeconomic status? How complicit am I in sexual assault or harassment happening to somebody who's of a lower socioeconomic status?
Mm.
How complicit am I in the injustice that is happening to them? And I would say quite complicit. So I think that's when we think about different ethnic, religious, or racial communities. I think what we need to think about is that we cannot just talk about Me Too as an issue in vacuum or isolation, but an issue that needs to be examined from all these different axes of identity.
Interesting. So it turns out that globally, almost 1 in 3 women, just considering gender, have experienced some kind of sexual violence, and that the Me Too movement is putting that on the record so that everyone understands just how much of a problem this is. And you're telling us it's not just a gender thing, it's way more
Right.
complicated than that. So let's get more specific. Can you help us understand some of the specific obstacles when it comes to discussing Me Too and all of those surrounding issues within the Muslim American community?
Right. So before I even launch into that, in terms of Muslim American community, I just want to say,
Yeah.
uh, in terms of all communities, uh, but thinking of the Muslim American community makes me think of this particular thing, is that there is, as you said, it is a global issue. So yes, there are specific issues that we face because of our ethnic, religious, or racial communities, but they're not completely unique. They're not 100% unique to our, and there are overarching themes that exist within those issues that we face within our individual communities. And so I think, for example, like, as you progress, I'm going to probably talk about family or something like, families are kind of important in Muslim American, but families are very important in like, rural white Midwestern communities or, in immigrant. So, I mean, there are overarching themes that connect us all. But talking about the obstacles when it comes to the Muslim American community, I think the first obstacle that occurs to me is the environment of Islamophobia that we live in. And it's not the obstacle that oftentimes people would think that Muslim women are facing, but I think that it is one of the ones that really weigh us down. If you live in an Islamophobic and xenophobic community, if you feel like the environment around you, the media around you is Islamophobic and hateful of people who come from other cultures and other countries, then Muslim women may not want to jump on the bandwagon that demonize men from those communities.
Mm,
They, I mean, it really puts us in a very difficult situation. So Muslim men already have stereotypes attached to them that are not, that are, debasing, and that are terrible and untrue. And saying that, our men come from like sexually repressed society, and they aren't exposed to like free liberated women, so they're eager to resort to like barbaric ways. This is like garbage xenophobia. And I mean, it has real life implications. I mean, you saw this kind of xenophobia in Europe, and uh, a lot of refugees were going towards Germany and other parts of Europe, and you were hearing like these reports like of European white women being afraid of these refugees. And you heard the same kind of rhetoric, like these men are just barbaric somehow. So this caricature, this stereotype of Muslim men as patriarchal or as oppressive is used to then justify foreign policy against countries that we have ties to. So, when politicians end up talking about bringing democracy or liberating women in these countries, they are relying on the stereotype that Muslim men are barbaric.
mm,
And that's simply not the case. A lot of the times the issues that we face in global south have nothing to do with this bizarre stereotype they have, but they have to do with corruption and military rule and military funding and IMF and all these other things. But our politicians often end up using these sorts of stereotypes to justify bombing countries that we might have diasporic ties to.
mm,
So I think, you know that's a big huge obstacle. The other obstacle, which is directly connected to this one, is that when Muslim women do end up speaking out within the United States, like when Muslim American women do end up speaking out, what happens is that it our speech gets co-opted by right-wing people as as a as something that's um see, we are the liberated country. If you just embrace our values and embrace our culture, then you too can speak up, and we have the liberated culture. Like, that's the thinking that some people have when a brown woman or a Muslim woman does speak up, or a black woman does speak up. They get this sense of superiority about them. So what ends up happening is that it ends up becoming an indictment. So when Muslim women do end up speaking up, it becomes an indictment against our culture, and then we get put down in our own culture. Like, why would you do that? Why would you put us in this bad light? So this is a real danger. Whether if we don't speak up, we have to suffer through sexual assault. When we do speak up, it gets co-opted to by right-wing Islamophobic hateful people. So so yeah, I mean, you know there's this additional trauma um that the neoliberal framework, or that people who are Islamophobic are gonna take our agency. So on top of suffering the trauma, we're suffering this additional trauma. So it's like a double trauma that we're suffering for simply speaking up. And I think that's something that a lot of minority communities, not just Muslim American communities, but a lot of minority communities have to go through, that that it becomes an indictment against our individual cultures as opposed to an issue of patriarchy that is pervasive globally, like you said, Sahar.
So it sounds like you're making a very clear connection between Islamophobia and Me Too movement. And correct me if I'm wrong, it sounds like you're saying that a part of the reason Muslim women do not report sexual violence is because they don't want to worsen the stereotypes of the men in their community.
Yes, definitely. 100%. 100%. I mean, like I said, when you live in Islamophobic environment, it becomes it's you know how your speech is going to be taken up. You know,
Yeah.
if I was to post something about my mosque on Facebook, you know how even well-meaning white feminists might read it. They'll read it as a confirmation of the stereotypes that they had to work so hard to get rid of. Be like, oh, so that stereotype was true, and that's quite problematic.
Okay, so you have a reason not to report sexual violence as a Muslim woman, and you explain two different kinds of reasons why a Muslim woman would not speak up. But so that lets me wonder, why would a Muslim woman speak up against sexual violence, knowing that it's going to be used against her and it's going to be used against the men in her community, bringing her down as well? So why speak up? What would give a woman the courage?
So I mean, I think that's more of a universal problem
Mm.
as well, and that goes for men and women and anybody who's a victim of sexual assault. Is that the cost of speaking up is so high that I really think that we shouldn't push on people to speak up until they are ready to speak up themselves. And them confiding in you as a confidant, as an individual person, might be sufficient for them. And that we shouldn't say that, no, 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 you got to liberate yourself and liberate yourself from the secret because the costs are so high. And you, as their confidant, don't need to bear that cost. They will need to bear the cost when they go public. So I think that this is a super personal decision, where you have to again have this sense that, for example, what is their mental health like? Can they sustain the onslaught that comes after? What is their socioeconomic condition? What if somebody sues them for libel for speaking up against somebody rich and famous? What is, I mean, there's, again, we come back to the intersectional analysis. Like, you have to look at all aspects of their condition before pushing them into something that they don't want to be pushed into.
So say someone is to open up to me, for example, and confide in me and tell me that they are a victim of sexual violence, and they explain, for let's say the reasons you gave, that they
Hmm.
don't want to go public because Muslim men already face all of these terrible stereotypes and
Right.
doesn't want to make it worse. And also, she doesn't want to add to the Islamophobia against her community in general, pushing for a change in her tradition. Do you think that the right response is to say, okay, that's justified and I understand? And how could that be justified? I'm worrying because you might want to push for justice and have the truth come to light. So how could we not make a big problem worse,
Right.
but still fight for justice?
I definitely see your point there. And I
What do
think, yeah, I mean, I think if you say to somebody, I'm here for you for when you are ready to disclose, or I'm here for you in general, whenever you want to discuss this particular topic,
you?
that's the kind of support they need. We have to be able to recognize that different communities experience the justice system very differently.
Mhm.
Suppose I report somebody And it's not just their immigration status that might be under scrutiny. Their
Mhm.
whole family might get deported.
Mm.
I mean, the carceral system, the detention, ICE, all of these things play into somebody's immigration status, plays into the consideration somebody might have when thinking about whether they should be or should not be speaking up. I think what the solution that we need to have to stop it from becoming a bigger issue is we need policy changes. We don't need to push people into disclosure. We need policy changes that create an environment that make it possible for people to speak their truth without fearing so much repercussion. If we make the environment such that, um, okay, for example, so many cities have such a big backlog of rape kits.
Mhm.
That's a systemic change that we need to have happen. We need to have funding to process rape kits, funding that is allocated specifically for rape kit processing. Or sometimes people who work in sexual assault, a lot of police departments may not even have a special victims unit. But for those that do, many of them are not trained in recognizing rape culture, in recognizing that their own language might be contributing to normalization. Like, so how many drinks had you had? What were you wearing? Like, they may not even recognize that what they are saying is attributing back to rape culture. So we need the kinds of changes where we're training people better. We're creating an environment where people are held to account. When, for example, sexual harassment or assault takes place on campus, campuses do their best to bury it because they don't want people to not send their children to their college because the college has bad rep, and they'll go out of the way to keep it out of the police files and make it a internal judicial issue. No, if it's an assault, it should be dealt with as such. So I think yeah, the changes need to be at a policy level. They don't need to be at a personal level where we're pushing people into disclosure.
Okay, so I have two questions, and one is about in general, but let's go to the specific one first. So tell me about the Me Too movement in Muslim American communities and how the hijab fits into all of this.
Yeah, so I think, like I said, like there are overarching themes that connect all communities, but I do see that there are specific sorts of sexual harassment and sexual assault that Muslim women face here in virtue of their identity as Muslims.
Okay.
So, because these women are Muslim or are seen as Muslim or are read as Muslim, they face a different thread of sexual violence or sexual assault. That thread still connects to larger themes that other women face, but that thread is a separate thread in itself. So, I want to focus like on hijab snatching as an example. So, which is basically when somebody walks up and like tries to pull off your hijab, and or they successfully pull off your hijab. And of course, this is a very traumatic incident to happen to a woman, and it's a very Islamophobic incident. But I want to say that it's not just simply Islamophobic, it's a case of sexual harassment, and in some cases downright sexual assault. So I want to, like, there are like two things that I can say to maybe convince you that this is not just Islamophobia at play when somebody's hijab's getting pulled off, but it's actually a case that should be considered under the Me Too umbrella. The first point is that we have to examine the incident from both a race lens and a gender lens.
Okay.
So both patriarchy and racism play a part in why that person's hijab got pulled off. So there have been several studies to show that women are marked out as Muslim, that they visibly look Muslim, whether it's through their skin color, their hair, their accent, their dress. They experience Islamophobic encounters at twice the rate as Muslim men. And when they wear hijab, it's even more so.
Wow. Okay.
Okay, so you may not even be Muslim, but be read as Muslim
Mm.
and still experience Islamophobic uh, violence. You still might experience that racialized violence. And then it also has been shown through studies that many Muslim American women are targets because because the stereotype that is attached to Muslim women is that we are passive, we're weak, we're oppressed, and that kind of makes us acceptable targets for violence. So and the statistics show that this sort of violence is primarily at the hand of white American men. So both in that scenario, both gender plays a role because hijab snatching is not happening to a guy, and
Mm,
also the stereotypes of being weak and passive are not attached to Muslim men, right? So gender is playing a role there, like, and then the race is playing a role because of how we are seen and read, like just visibly. So, because people are like, Muslims are not a race. Yes, we're not a race, but we're racialized.
mm,
We're read as Muslim. So, you don't, again, have to be Muslim to be read as a Muslim. You, you could just be brown and be read as Muslim and actually be Hindu or be an atheist or whatever, right? And so, in that sense, the race is also playing a particular role. What we consider naked differs from society to society. And I'm borrowing this from a philosopher called Talia May Becher, who writes that what constitutes nakedness, what is considered naked, is kind of tricky because it changes from different contexts. So, what would be considered naked in an Aboriginal culture is very different. What would be considered naked in a European or American culture, which would be very different than what would be considered naked in a Muslim majority culture. So so yeah, I mean, okay, this is cloth, this is naked, right? This is the physical boundary that we're talking about right now. But then there are moral boundary as well. So if I was in an American context and I said to somebody, "Am I naked?" They would say, "No, you're not naked." But maybe in some context, maybe I'd be considered naked. So the moral meaning is attached by the culture that I belong to, right? The physical one is on the cloth, but the moral one is coming from the culture. So women wear hijab for many, 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 many number of reasons. When I used to live in Pakistan, I would like cover my head because there was so much pollution and so on and so forth. And like literally, like when you come home, like you're washing off like all the pollution of your face. Like, why would you want to expose it? And there's a lot of dust and stuff. By the way, Saudi men also cover their head with like their thing. So they're also saving themselves from the sunburn. So I mean, people have multiple reasons for covering their head, right? But for some Muslim women, not all, but for some Muslim women, they wear the hijab because they see it as part and parcel of their religion. They see it as part of what it means to submit to God.
mm.
They see it as fulfilling one of the commandments as described in Islam. So they're not doing it for their men or something. They're doing it because they consider themselves practicing Muslims, right? So for them, for women who do it for reasons of modesty, for reasons where they consider it that God is telling them that to be modest, their hair has to be covered. For them to be seen without their hijab is like for me to be seen without my shirt.
Naked.
Naked, exactly, right? So my sister is a hijabi. I mean, if her brother-in-law is to walk into a room and she wasn't wearing a hijab, she would like freak out. She'd be the same way I would freak out if my brother-in-law walked into the room and I wasn't wearing my shirt. Like I'd be like, get out, like what, like that. So I think you know the the idea then is that when the hijab is experienced by the person who's wearing the hijab as part of what is clothing them, when you snatch it away, that's definitely a sexual assault happening to you because you're being made naked, you're being humiliated in that moment. So those two particular considerations, the humiliation that happens via the inseparable part of the race and the gender aspect, and then the second one, which is the violation of your norms of nakedness, those two considerations together kind of convince me that when somebody's hijab is getting stripped off, it's not just Islamophobia at play, but it's actually a sexual assault at play.
Interesting. And would you have the same kind of um, verdict on these countries that have been recently making the hijab illegal? Is it a forcing of the woman to oppress herself to make herself naked, or how should we understand that? Is it similar or not?
Yeah, I mean, No, I like the way, I like where you're going, because that is state violence.
Right? The government is telling women that they're not allowed to cover what they think they need to cover.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, imagine if the US government said, you know, women are no longer allowed to wear shirts.
Right.
Kind of, I'm a Star Trek junkie, and so like it makes me think of the Ferengi, and the Ferengis don't allow their women to wear clothes, and they consider it that the women are overreaching if they wear their clothes, and they're not being in their place if they wear clothes. And I thought that was like very interesting for the times that that particular Star Trek was released, because it, to me, it corresponds completely to telling women not to wear hijab. And one of the main character, Quark, his mom starts wearing clothes, and she starts engaging in business. So women are also not allowed to engage in business on their home planet. And he's just horrified. He's like, you're disgracing me, because you're overreaching your place as a woman. You're just supposed to cook and feed me and make my life better. You're not supposed to be wearing clothes. And that's essentially, and that was the law of the land. And towards the end, spoiler alert, they changed the law towards the end of that, the Next Generation series, in part because of Mugi, who's Quark's mother. Her actions of wearing clothes, like it causes a cascade of events where they eventually change the law and allow women to wear whatever they're wearing, or not wear whatever they're wearing. And I think this regulation of women's clothing as like a it is essentially controlling our agency. Whether you tell us to cover ourselves up, cover yourself up, or you're telling us derobe yourself, it's the same thing. Why are governments fixated on what women wear?
Mhm.
It's just like, I mean, people can negotiate their own idea of what they are comfortable uncovering or covering. Why does the state need to regulate it? I'm not quite sure. Well, I know why, patriarchy, but and rape culture and so on and so forth, right? But yeah, to me, it's somebody saying take off your hijab. The state saying take off your hijab is the same as the state saying you have to wear a hijab.
Mm,
It's the
in-
same thing.
interesting.
And
And
I see it as a form of yeah, state violence.
what are some of the internal complexities that make it harder for a Muslim woman to report sexual violence?
Yeah, so I mean, there are a lot of internal complexities. I can't go into all of them. I'll just briefly touch on one or two. One is that the family unit is of a lot of importance within Islam itself, like within the prescriptive religion, like religion is prescribed, the family unit is of a lot of importance. And that has manifested in itself into Muslim cultures around the world differently. But what that means within the discourse of Me Too is that for a lot of Muslim women, they are afraid to bring they're afraid to bring pain and hardship onto their parents, because it is not just them that is going to undergo the scrutiny, but also their whole family. I think in a lot of Muslim cultures, uh, we are very communal, we're less individualistic. And what happens is that our sense of self is intricately tied in with our families. So for somebody to say, well, cut yourself out from your family, wouldn't make sense, because the family is part and parcel of who we are. Or what do you want, as opposed to what your family wants? Well, what my family wants is part and parcel of what I want. And so in that vein, when there is a case of sexual assault, to bring it up is just not hardship for the individual, it's hardship for everybody that loves that particular individual, that is tied into that particular individual. And I think that's a really important thing to think about. Then there's the issue of proximity. A lot of Muslim American families live in close proximity to one another, and so when there is a case of sexual harassment that is within the community and you bring it up, you disrupt actual physical spaces. So people have a hard time interacting with one another, because one amidst them is one accuser and one perpetrator, and they don't know how to navigate that. And not having to create that disruption could be enough for a person not wanting to report. A lot of people tell women to forgive their perpetrator because, again, of family issues and proximity issues. And then last but not least, I want to talk about the politics of respectability, which is this idea that, which is prevalent in all communities, majority, minority, all sorts of communities, which is this idea that women end up policing other women's behaviors. Like, if you just don't dress like this, if you just don't behave like this, if you just don't talk like that, things of that nature wouldn't happen to you. So when something does happen to you, your respectability gets into question rather than the perpetrator's um, action. So those are just few of the internal dynamics. There are many, many more, but those are just some few of the internal complexities that Muslim Americans face.
Thank you. Thank you for shining light on that. And to wrap us up, what are your concluding thoughts on this, the Me Too movement in Muslim American communities, within or with relations to other communities? Anything you want us to think about as we close?
One, we need to have policy level change
Mm,
within the state. Two, we need to think about the issue of Me Too from a lens that considers all aspects of a person's disadvantages that they might be facing, whether that's immigration, xenophobia, racism, all those aspects need to be taken into consideration. And three, because I like things in three, I'm sure there's lots more. Three would be that I think Muslim communities themselves need to allow for that discussion to take place and be and feel strong enough or create accountability within communities in such a way that it doesn't feed into the right wing media, but it doesn't tamp down the discussion of sexual assault and harassment. So we need to create structures within our communities where we don't fall prey to Islamophobic, hateful people, but we also don't tell Muslim women to keep silent about these issues simply because we're afraid of Islamophobic violence that is to follow from that disclosure.